Joint ventures are normally used for overseas investment, right? In the case of overseas investment, the possible cultural conflict is shadowed by the fact that when a company goes in to an overseas market, there is definitely a problem of culture. The company is moving from one kind of culture into another kind of culture. In this situation, it makes sense for the company to tie up with another company which has adapted itself to that new culture, and therefore a joint venture is normally used when a company moves overseas. Let's look at overseas trade and investment, which is becoming very important by the day. One thing to remember is overseas trade, overseas investment is a two-way process, right? Just as it gives us an opportunity to trade overseas, to invest overseas, it also gives overseas companies the opportunity to enter our own country and our own domestic market. It may in turn have an impact on our functioning within the country. The second point to be noted is that yes, if we calibrate our overseas trade sufficiently, we can use it as the starting point for overseas investment. Overseas trade can lead to a growth in customer perceptions about our company, which in turn can be capitalized on for investment in that overseas country. Another advantage of overseas investment is that it opens up the avenue of cheaper finance. In one of the earlier sessions, we had seen that interest costs are much lower in the developed countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, many countries in Europe. Interest rates are much lower than they are in India. So a company from India, if it invests in one of those overseas, one of the other countries, it can take use of this cheaper finance. And of course, there is finally the question of being able to spread the risks. We've so far seen the advantages of being involved in overseas investment, right? But let's look also at the barriers to overseas business. Let's classify these barriers as legal barriers and non-legal barriers, right? Legal barriers to doing overseas business, one is quotas. Till a few years back, there were quotas even for textiles. Different countries in the world had certain percentage of textiles which they could export to other countries. Fortunately, those quotas for textiles have now been removed. However, when it comes to Japanese cars into the US, that's another quota which used to persist for a very long period of time, though it's now disappeared. Then you have import bans which prevent certain kinds of products being imported into the country. As you would be aware, before liberalization in India, virtually nothing could be imported, right? We are now in a situation where perhaps on maybe 5 or 10% of products cannot be imported anymore. Then when it comes to foreign ownership, there are restrictions, right? That's another difficulty in doing overseas business. Again, in India, before liberalization, overseas ownership was limited to a very, very small number of areas. Even today, though overseas investment is possible in India, but there are very strict limitations on the percentage of holding which it is possible for the overseas investor to have. And then finally, there is the legal barrier of tariffs. Tariffs are the import duties that are put on a particular product. Now, import duties, whether it is 10% or it is 15% or 20%, the import duty put on a product is sufficient to make that product less competitive in that particular market. This is another legal barrier to trading in the market. Other barriers to overseas business are language and culture, skill levels. A company in moving from, let's say, India to Africa may find that it is not in a position in that location to access the same kind of qualified personnel that it is able to do in India. On the other hand, a company moving from a country like India to a country in Europe, for instance, may find that the wage levels there are significantly higher, and therefore the economics of that particular operation may therefore be different. And finally, there is the question of infrastructure. Here, any foreign company coming into India would find that the physical infrastructure in which they see in this country is inferior to what they are used to in their own country. So these are the kinds of barriers that exist in overseas, particularly in the case of overseas investment.